Hi, everyone. I'm Edwin Rutsch, Director of the Center for Building a Culture of Empathy. And today I'm here with Peter Sears to talk about empathy. And thanks for joining me for this discussion, Peter.
It's great to be here, Edwin.
Well, let me give a little bit of an overview about your bio. You're a psychologist, a writer, and a consultant, and you gained your PhD from, this is it, Loughborough University.
That's pretty good, yeah.
You're pretty close yeah. So in London, UK, with a thesis in Understanding Empathic Leadership in Elite Sports. You hold a master's degree in Jung and Post-Jungian Studies and a master's degree in Human Resource Management and Industrial Relations. And you have a BSc in psychology. And you're the author, I guess you took your PhD and turned it into a book. Author of Empathic Leadership, Lessons from Elite Sports. And so we wanted to talk about your book and just your interest in empathy. Is there anything you want to add to that intro?
Yes, great. Yeah, I kind of did take what I learned from my PhD and turn it into a book, but hopefully I've written it in a way that is extremely accessible to everybody who'd be interested.
Well, you have a model for empathic leadership that I'd really like to explore and talk about. But before we jump into that, like, what got you interested in empathy to begin with? Like, where'd that interest and how did it kind of grow or develop?
So I'd studied psychology and behavior from a variety of directions, really, from depth psychology to neuroscience. And I found that the most interesting area for me was always emotions and how they inspire behavior or influence behavior. Um, and then once I found that emotions was the most interesting area to me, empathy kind of came along with that because it's the understanding of somebody else's emotions. And I think that's really important in many roles, but particularly in roles of leadership. And I've always had an interest in sport and often been made a leader of sports teams. And I always believed that rather than being a very vocal person on a pitch or court, it had more to do with my relationships with other team members and the importance of understanding different people and that communication needs to be tailored depending on who people are. That I could get on with everybody rather than just one or two people in a team, and that really interested me. And I looked at other leaders, and they often seemed the most successful ones as time was going by seemed to be more the people managers, the people that really got other people. And so that got me really interested in the role of empathy in sport leadership. And I took the idea to Loughborough because it's the top university in the world for sport-related research. And they loved the idea because nobody else had done it yet. And once I started talking to coaches of elite teams in sport, I was really inspired by how interested they were in empathy and how aware they were of how they use it and the possibilities that lay behind it.
Well, I see that you have this model of empathic leadership, and one of the areas of your book is person-centered focus. So were you like influenced by Carl Rogers and his person-centered approach?
Yeah. So that was like the basis of my understanding of that. And then I started coming across literature where organisations were moving towards a more worker-centered approach, and in sport, a more athlete-centered approach. And the more I spoke to coaches, the more it resonated with what Rogers' views were, that everything centres on the individual. And it's a difficult idea sometimes to get across because we often talk about team sport where the team is more important than the individual. So it kind of clashes with that idea in that unless you cater for the individual, the team is not going to be a cohesive and high-performing unit.
Well, you developed, I guess you developed this model. Let me see if I can show this. So this is your model. It's probably a little hard for everyone to see, but this is sort of the framework, it seems, that you developed for kind of talking about empathic leadership in sports. And you're saying that it overlaps with pretty much any sort of leadership. And how did you come to develop that model?
It was drawn from the data. So I interviewed 20 leaders of teams around the world in elite sport. 11 were at international level. So I collected their stories. I used a narrative inquiry method, collecting stories of where they felt empathy had been demonstrated, used as a tool, or proved beneficial, or perhaps where empathy was lacking. So often coaches gave examples of leaders they experienced when they were athletes themselves, maybe 20 years ago, and compared how things are now and how some of the practices would have just been unacceptable because of the lack of empathy. So using that method of narrative inquiry, analysing the data, these were the main areas that came out as far as leaders in sport today were concerned, of where empathy is employed in leadership.
Okay, so that, am I understanding that mile just grew out of your interviews then?
That's right, yeah.
Okay, so naturally developed. Well, the model, maybe you can talk a little bit about it. It looks like, kind of giving overall framework, looks like you place self-empathy in the center, and then around that are these other kind of phenomenon or capacities, or I'm not sure what you call them.
Yeah, so the research proceeded with obviously me doing a lot of literature reviews and understanding empathy as a potential tool for leadership, but then integrating that with the stories I was hearing from coaches. And when they started talking about the importance of looking after themselves, about understanding themselves, about being aware of their own emotions and how they affect things, about emotional contagion, about how to understand how they behave in certain situations, this all resonated with the literature on self-empathy. So I began to talk more and more to elite coaches about some of the things they do to help themselves in that way, and learned about the importance of mentors, for example, about certain practices like meditation, about reflexive practices like being observed during training sessions or during matches. A lot of the elite coaches have cameras on them to observe their behavior, and so they can see to some degree what the athletes on the court or the field are seeing, to understand how that might be affecting the atmosphere or the emotional environment.
Well, in terms of self-empathy, one of the practices I find very helpful is like the empathy circle, which you took part in. So it's a chance to just be heard by someone else, where they're not giving you advice, they're not judging you, you're just able to express yourself, and then the others reflect back. It's very similar. I mean, it's like therapy pretty much is sort of based on that, where a person gets an hour and they just get to talk about whatever is kind of going on in their mind or their body. And then the therapist or the listener or just listens and gives a space for the person to sort of unfold. And so it seems to me, I find that it's a really good aspect for self-empathy.
Yeah, there was one coach who'd been through therapy and used that as part of his leadership development. But that's, I think, where the role of mentors come in. A couple of the coaches said that they had different mentors for different aspects of their work. So if it was to do with relationships or players, athletes, relationships, they'd go to one mentor and explain to them what was going on. And often it was just that, as you say, that practice of just being heard and maybe listening to yourself tell somebody else, that allows you to reflect and understand more what's going on yourself.
What is the mental? That's the term I haven't heard.
A mentor.
Oh, mentor. Okay, that's the UK.
My silly accent.
Mentor, having so it's a mentor. So you have someone that you can go to who basically does that listening to you, and you can sort of open up to and kind of get off your chest, whatever, and they might give you some support or advice or something.
Yeah, and I think that's important in all industries. I mean, even psychotherapists themselves have their own mentors or supervisors that they go to reflect their work. So I think it's something that we could all do with if it's possible.
Yeah, I have that too. Just got all these different projects going, creates a lot of stress. So I've just got people who will just listen to me. I just go, they're just empathically listening, doing empathic reflection. I just get stuff off my chest, kind of explore ideas, and I just feel better, after. I feel like there's a load off my chest afterwards.
Yeah, I think anybody who's ever done that, will feel the same. Yeah.
Yeah. So, okay, so you've got this model. Were you okay with, like, if we go through the model,
Yeah,
kind
fine.
of, you have the self-empathy at the core, and are you starting with empathic communication, or do you just kind of start anywhere on that
Yeah, you can.
spiral around it?
I think you can start anywhere, but we can start with empathic communication. So I think that starts with what we've just been talking about listening. That's the really important key skill that came across from the coaches I spoke to, that was probably different to when they were athletes. You go back 20 years, there wasn't so much listening going on by a leader in sport. It was more a sort of tell what to do culture. The coaches that I spoke to often use phrases like "it used to be my way or the highway," and there are consequences to that sort of approach. So if you get a highly talented athlete who maybe doesn't feel they fit in, or doesn't feel understood, doesn't feel listened to, they're going to not perform, or perhaps move on to a different organization. So a lot of talent can be lost that way. But also it stops people from being themselves if they don't feel heard. So it stops any sort of individuality or creativity coming out. Um, the other thing about communication that head coaches told me was that they use any opportunity to communicate with their athletes. So it might be traveling to an away match or something on the coach, train, plane, whatever. They'll often sort of select somebody to go and sit next to, just have general chats to, not necessarily about the sport, but about anything in life. And often there'll be moments where there's a connection, and that connection is really important. It enhances trust, it brings groups closer together, and it adds to that feeling understood of the athlete. So coaches said that they often bring athletes into their office for a chat, but the most important chats they feel that they get the most from is that informal conversation on transport, or perhaps on the training pitch, when the athlete doesn't feel under any pressure, doesn't see much in it, but all the time the head coach is gathering information about the athlete, about their whole lives, in order to understand them better. And if they understand them better, then their empathy becomes more useful, more accurate.
So what I'm starting to see is we have different, so say, leadership models. One sort of a top-down, just do what I say,
Mm.
and kind of maybe using intimidation, or being, just I'm the boss, do what I say, versus empathic leadership, which is more of a communication, relational type of approach. So do you see those as two different
Yeah,
models?
very much so. And that's the next kind of aspect of empathic leadership, as I see it, is the relationship. So the relationships that head coaches were telling me about were a lot closer than they were used to when they were athletes themselves. So this even led, some of the head coaches were inviting athletes and their families round to dinner. They were organising events outside of the sport, like to go and see a music gig or something like that, just to get people to understand each other better. All helps to develop empathy in a group and between the head coach and the athlete. Um, the relationship being close is easily observed by any of us who watch sport on TV these days. We see head coaches hugging players where once they might have high-fived or a handshake. It's a physically close relationship now, which I think is indicative of the depth of their relationship in general. That part of the relationship isn't always easy, of course, because you've got some people who won't perhaps like that physicality between their leader and themselves. So again, the empathy and understanding helps that, because coaches will learn which players or athletes like that and which don't, which to wait for them to come to them rather than go the other way, or under what set of circumstances it's okay to be physical. And the best way is obviously when it just feels natural. And a lot of the head coaches was saying to me that they think that they're a different kind of person to who led teams in the past in sport, in that they know when those moments are right, because they're that sort of person, that they understand people. But those sort of people skills, or skills of empathy perhaps, weren't a consideration 20 years ago. Not by obviously I'm generalizing. I'm sure there were empathic leaders 20 years ago plus, but that that skill is more valued now. Let's say that. So the coaches that are leading today often said to me that maybe their skill set wasn't right for the previous era, but it's right for now. And that sort of comes out in many ways. There was lots of talk from head coaches about how interested they are in the wider lives of the athletes, not just to collect data on them and understand them better, but genuinely invested in their futures. You know, if they were doing exams for anything else as young athletes or things like that, some of the coaches were saying to me, seeing that person succeed in other areas is just as important to me as us winning trophies. You know, and that was indicative of the kind of characters that I spoke to at a very high level in sport as well. You know, you think that maybe everything's about the game, but it's not. That was showing you that they're really invested in the people they lead. And when the athlete feels that investment, when the athlete feels that they matter, that they're understood and they're heard, then they are more committed to that coach, more influenced by that coach, which gives the coach more power, if you like. So it has, you know, many repercussions.
Well, another benefit I would think is that if an athlete is highly stressed, you know, always feeling anxious, that's going to reduce their performance. So I was just watching, you know, what is it, Air, whatever, the movie about Michael Jordan, you know, the shoes.
Yeah.
And the person, you know, that's Matt Damon character, he's pointing out, he said that Michael Jordan looks so relaxed, very calm and relaxed. Like he's not all tense. So he's just like totally relaxed doing what he does. And there's sort of an efficiency in that relaxation that happens. You're able to sort of be sort of your best, at your best capacity. And I'm just, and I would see, I would speculate from what I've seen, is that if the athletes can feel relaxed like that because they've been heard, when you've been heard and understood and be able to express yourself, it creates a sense of relaxation versus if you're like always afraid or nervous and so forth, you got all that tension going on.
Yeah, so that's something that's really tested at a high level in sport because it's such a high pressure environment, isn't it? You know, you're on a court or a pitch, asked to perform in front of millions, perhaps billions of people, and all the pressure is on you, and you're only as good as your last performance, and it's going to be written about, it's going to be talked about, it's going to be discussed by fans. So there's a lot of pressure on athletes today, probably more than ever. But what you say is right, that if you feel stress physiologically and psychologically, you're not going to be at your best. And the whole environment, therefore, needs to be a relaxed environment. And that's one of the other aspects of empathic leadership to talk about is the empathic environment, the empathic culture around athletes. So it's also about, often when we go to work in professional environments, especially high profile professional environments, some people tend to put on a mask and not be themselves. And that is in itself draining. If you can be seen for who you are by your peers, you know, your teammates, your coach, then that's really empowering and energizing.
So is that the empathic climates that you're talking about? It's the whole, I guess, the whole team, the whole environment that the athletes and the coaches are working within. Is that sort of cultural? I call it a culture of empathy, but you're calling it empathic climates.
Yeah, well, I think that's the same thing. Yeah, it's about feeling that caring environment that other people want you to do well. And if an athlete feels that their coach wants them to do well in life in general, then that's a really powerful thing. Yeah. As you know, empathy is contagious. So if a coach is leading by example, then empathy will spread throughout a team. But there are other ways that perhaps we can talk about later about how empathy can be developed within teams as well. But that whole environment needs to be, obviously in sport, it needs to be a competitive environment, but competitive with the opposition, not competitive within the team.
Well, a story that comes to mind sort of that models this is I was taking a workshop and, you know, that we were given an assignment in this workshop, and one of the people, you know, sitting next to, he didn't understand what the assignment was. I didn't understand the assignment either, but I usually don't care. You know, I just do whatever I want with the assignments. but he was like feeling really nervous, and he asked for explanation of what the assignment was. And the instructor just explained it, but the more he explained, the more confused the person became, to the point where he almost just gave up, right? Just like, oh, I don't understand what he's talking about. And you could see he was getting really tense. And so when the assignment happened, he was in my team and then all I did was say, I started doing empathic listening with him. So I said, oh, I'm hearing that you're upset and you're feeling confused by what's going on. And he said, yeah. And it's like, this is really frustrating. I feel like this is the political progressives and I don't really belong here. And I'm like ready to leave. And so I just reflected, yeah, you're just feeling like you don't belong. And then I would also kind of reflect what I was hearing his needs were, like, oh, you would like a sense of belonging. You would like a sense of a feeling of clarity. And I just did this empathic listening to him for pretty much most of the assignments, and I would write down the words. And while I was writing down the words, I created out of Post-its a little tree. I call it the empathy tree. And then so we just did this listening. And at the end, we went around and everybody, was able to report back about their experience. And he was so eloquent. He was saying, this was so good. This was amazing. And it was just the eloquence was just, how articulate he was and eloquent. And everybody was like, wow, Edwin, what did you do? And I said, I listened to him.
Yeah, that's all.
But that totally reduced his stress, gave him a sense of connection, gave him a sense of clarity, and it's just kind of resolved. Instead of just telling him what to do, I just listened to him and let that sort of unfold. So in a sense, we were a team at that point, right? We were a team working on this project, and it was, as a fellow team member, I was just listening to him, and it had just profound effects.
But if a leader behaves in that way to an athlete, it's such a powerful thing because they're not having that effect on that one athlete. The others are observing, like athletes are observing their head coach all the time. So anything they do, they're picking up, oh, he's that kind of guy, he's bothering to understand him. He cares enough to bother to understand the person that's there. So he's going to do the same for me. So that really has a big effect on how committed and how much they trust a leader. But also, when you were saying about that feeling listened to, understood, and being yourself, what that also does to a group in any industry is allow people to be more creative. So they're more likely to come forward with ideas. They're more likely to speak out if a bad idea is being put into practice. So if they feel that the leader trusts them that much, that they can speak out and it's not going to be a problem, then you've got a lot more brains on tasks, so it's a really important thing.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. You mentioned that about the effect on other people. It's just not the effect on that one person, because other people came to me afterwards. They said, after that experience, it changed the whole workshop for me, the whole experience. Other people were kind of feeling kind of confused of how the leader, the facilitator was, but that experience just affected everyone else. And they were actually commenting to me about it afterwards. So,
yeah. So head coaches are in obviously lots of different scenarios in their week's work. One of the scenarios is where they're on the court side or on the pitch side, and they've got other squad players sitting around them. And they're often talking to their coaches about what's going on the court or the field of play. And sometimes if they're being critical and then all these other substitutes or are listening, then that puts them under extra stress because they think, oh, that's what he's going to do when I'm on there. So they're always being observed and listened to, even when it's probably the furthest from their mind that the guys behind them are watching and listening to me now.
Yeah, that's great. So the other part is, I talk about a culture of empathy. So I see that it's not, there's a lot of times it's like, oh, as a leader, you've got to just empathize with all the workers. And sometimes the idea is that you're kind of giving them everything they want, but yeah. I see the empathy is mutual. So it's somehow the leader has to get their empathy bath, their empathy support as well. So wonder how that's part of the climate, right? It's like, the leader can't just be constantly listening to everyone and not be heard or understood themselves.
Yeah, and that when the relationship gets closer and becomes more of an empathic relationship, often the athlete can make decisions on the field of play or on the court because they know what their coach is thinking in that moment. Just a glance might be enough rather than an actual message having to get on. So the closer relationship, I liken it to being in a family. The more you know each other, the more you can predict what people are thinking and how they feel about situations. So if you walk into a room with a member of your family and something's going on in the room, you'll probably understand your family member feels about that situation, whether they want to react by leaving or whether they feel uneasy or they're excited by that event. And it's the same in sport. If a head coach is uh, really known to their athletes, then an athlete is going to know what a head coach thinks about this situation and how they'll want them to react without even saying anything. If they do need to say anything, of course, then the head coach will understand how best to tailor that communication by knowing the individual better. So that's like kind of empathic communication, when the coach is speaking rather than listening, is tailoring the information for the individual.
Is there something that coaches said they did for their own personal support? Like do they have empathy buddies who are other coaches or something, or do they have their personal mentor or whatever, so that they get a sense of being heard and supported? Was there any strategies they had for that?
Yeah, so mentors was a big thing, as we talked about earlier, but also just coaches talking between themselves about how they feel. So I had an ice hockey coach talk to his other coaches while the team were on the ice warming up, and it was an important match. And the head coach said to his assistant, I think they're nervous. The players, the way they're skating, it looks like they're nervous. We need to do something about this, otherwise they're not going to perform. And the other coaches talked with the head coach, and they realised that it wasn't the athletes that were nervous; it was the coaches that felt nervous. And so that goes back to self-empathy and understanding what's going on and where to draw a line between your own emotions and that of the athletes as a group, because that could have led to that head coach talking to his athletes in a completely different way that might have inhibited their performance rather than supported it.
Yeah, well, that's creating that empathic climate. The approach that I use is the empathy circle. So now we just got, actually, the background here is this property that my brother bought. We're setting up the empathy center that I'm managing. And now I'm kind of moving from, just working on my own to sort of managing this big property. And boy, there's, looking at hiring people and doing all the stuff. It's a lot of responsibility. So
you're an empathic leader now, Edwin.
I know I'm moving into the reality of it. It's one thing to say it; it's the other to actually do it and deal with the individual issues that come up.
Yeah, that's something else that came up. That you often get coaches who may talk about empathy or about athlete-centered care or putting the athlete first or whatever, but unless they follow through with that, and it's got no power with athletes. Athletes will soon see through that sort of leadership. If I had, I've spoken to athletes who said that they've had coaches promise to do something for them or look after them or something, but they're not follow through on the promise. So it's like the leader thinks they're getting something from the moment when they tell the athlete that, but if they don't follow through on the promise, then all the power of empathy is gone. There's the commitment's not going to be there. The trust isn't going to be there. All the magic's dead.
Well, what I've been trying to implement is the empathy circle practice. So, people have been coming up, staying, volunteering, doing work there. And we have empathy circles, which, as I mentioned, you took part in, where we have that, mutual listening. And our topic is, what are, feelings of concern, worry, or fear you have about, developing this space. And it's like people just have a space to just share those concerns. And I found that that's been very grounding to have sort of a framework, a structure like that to, have the whole dialogues with.
Yeah, it allows people to be honest, and you're going to get ideas like the creativity thing, because if people know they're going to be listened to, then they're going to tell you all sorts of things. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's also the concerns that came up that I wouldn't have thought of. It's like there's these concerns that we have that, there's in regular conversation, they don't come up that easy, but sort of by a structured format like that, it somehow creates space for those concerns to arise, which I find very helpful. And I think once they're heard, that it kind of helps reduce those concerns and stresses.
Yeah, and as you get to know people, you can understand who has strengths in certain areas. So if you have any sort of tasks, you can appropriate those tasks to different people. So understanding the strengths of people only comes with developing that relationship. And you think about that way of leading that you're demonstrating at the moment and compare it with someone at the start of the Industrial Revolution. I often mention the character Henry Wilcox in Forster's Howard's End. He says, there's a quote in the book where he says, I know the faces of the men that work for me, but I don't know what's beneath them.
Interesting.
So I think we've come a long way from that.
Okay, so moving on in your model, we talked about empathic climates, and then it was person-centered focus.
Yeah, so that's something where a lot of the coaches were telling me about looking into the wider lives of their athletes. So one coach, for example, said to me that it's no good me perfecting all the technical stuff on the training pitch if I know there's something awful going on at home with this athlete. If he's going through a divorce, he might be in an abusive relationship, he could have addiction problems, anything like that. So it's about a holistic look at the athlete to understand their world, their problems, and if possible, to help them. And again, if an athlete is helped by a leader rather than cut from a team because they've got a problem, then the other athletes are going to observe that and think, well, it's okay for me to be honest. And it might be a job for the leader at some point to say, I can see this is having too much of an impact on your performances, so I'm going to have to take you out of the team for a bit. But if they don't do that immediately, and if they're there to support in any way they can, then that's again a very powerful thing for a leader to do, and gives them greater influence in the future.
How do you deal with the aspect of this is time consuming, right? Like with the empathy circle, the empathic listening, it's very time consuming. And then at some point you gotta, there's things that need to be done, and you don't have time for sort of discussing every issue.
Yeah, that's one thing about the careers of head coaches I was just in awe of. The hours they put into their job is phenomenal. And I spoke to them about not just the time of empathizing, but also the emotional drain of empathizing. Is that a problem? Does it lead to burnout sooner? But all of the head coaches said to me that sharing in the lives and worlds of these athletes around them gives them more positive feelings than negative, because they're seeing them succeed in things, they're seeing them perform well, they're seeing there's always more positive things than negative. But added to the athletes, the number of people that head coaches in sport today have to have relationships with has grown immensely. There's the medical staff that's grown. There's things like dietitians, physios, things like that. And then there's the management above. There's the youth academies below. And then you've got to have relationships with press, with officials, with rivals, with sponsors. And there's so many relationships. It's a multifaceted career, And so it must be very difficult to know where to draw the line with things like time and emotional energy.
Yeah. So, okay, that's person-centered. And then we have the empathic accuracy is another area.
Yeah, so in the chapter of the book on empathic accuracy, empathic accuracy obviously centers on making sure that you understand people well enough to be able to understand what's going on inside them with their thoughts, their emotions, their intentions. And some of the head coaches I spoke to said that how that helps them choose people for certain matches or games or particular scenarios, like in football or soccer, we get penalty shootouts sometimes, which is a very high pressure moment. And by understanding individual athletes better, you can choose perhaps the ones you think will deal with that pressure better. But also to understand what players' intentions are in a wider view of their career. So there's lots of competing things for athletes today. There's their own brand. There's their international career, as well as their club career. There's their own career. So is this athlete here to make a name for himself so he can move on to a different club? Is this athlete here just to promote himself and his aftershave brand or whatever? Is he making more money from that than he does from the game? I had with social media that magnifies it even further still. So I had head coaches talk to me about losing a match, for example, and then going home and reading on Twitter that one of their athletes has said about what a great goal he scored in this game, and was just focusing on his own personal contribution to the match. And the other athletes come in the next day and say to the coach, "Have you seen this? You know, this is like, we're not important to him. You know, it's affecting the group." So there's lots of ways, and also to evaluate the potential and the ambition of athletes. If you know and understand them well, you can see perhaps how far they're prepared to go, what they're prepared to do to get there, and whether decisions like whether to keep, retain, or move talent on is helped by that empathic accuracy.
Okay, well, the next one is developing empathy, which is like in that scenario you just said, that's a conflict, right? There's a conflict between some of the athletes and that person who's just sort of promoting themselves.
Yeah.
And somehow you have to be able to negotiate and work through those conflict. And so that's sort of like developing empathy in a high stress, in a conflict situation.
I think if you have got individuals who are that way inclined, I think they're probably brought back within the fold of the team by doing some of the things that the head coaches told me they do to improve empathy in the climate, or to develop empathy within teams. So they do things like they ask individual athletes to stand in front of the others and tell them biographical stories about their childhood, where they came from. So lots of sports are very international now, particularly football, soccer in our country. There's players from, as many countries as you could think of playing in our Premier League. And the squads of players who are just astounded by some of the experiences of some of the African players, for example, when they grew up playing the sport, compared with some of the European stars who have been inside academies all of their career. Understanding those differences and the things that people have gone through to get to where they are makes you appreciate them more as a teammate, and makes you understand why they're so determined in matches, or what makes them angry, or what fires them up in moments. So that sharing of biographical stories is really helpful. They also do things like just start any way that conversations can begin between athletes is useful. So a couple of the clubs that I spoke with use conversation cubes, just with single lines on each side of a dice, and they're rolled in small groups. And whatever subject comes up, they start discussing, or a scenario that comes up, perhaps where they've got to choose one teammate who'd be best in that situation, explain why. Just all about understanding perspectives again, and kind of practicing empathy, if you like, but getting to know and understand your teammate better.
So you're seeing that developing empathy then is one is personal storytelling, share kind of personal stories about yourself. And there's all kinds of different activities that can help create conversations and dialogues where people can share more deeply.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And there's another thing that they do. So if I keep talking about football or soccer, but it's obviously the biggest sport where I'm living. But when you get 11 on a team, on a football team, for example, this is going to be mirrored in all other sports. But if in training some of the athletes can play in other people's position, especially positions that link with each other during competition, then they get to understand the struggles, or the things that their colleagues are up against in that situation, and how difficult it is to play a pass to them, for example. So by swapping over positions every now and again, it allows you to understand the perspective of your teammates, and some of the clubs do that as well. Yeah.
Well, I've been sort of exploring this field of empathy for probably about 15 years now. And what I found was, some of the earliest writings, in depth, I find were Carl Rogers, and his empathic, that he sort of developed that active listening, empathic listening process and he was quite eloquent in how he describes it and kind of gives the benefits of it and the process of it. And it's taking that into the empathy circle process where we have, mutual small groups, but there's that mutual listening, on different topics. So of those many different, activities, I've sort of found that as one of the most fundamental, easiest, first step gateway practices. I'm just wondering, you took part in one too. I'm just wondering how your experience was with that.
Yeah, I thought it was I thought it was great, and I think it's something that sports teams could use. That, that's going after the same thing as what they want. They want to have athletes listened to, understood, and feel heard. So your empathy circles does that perfectly. So I can see that would be really beneficial for squads of athletes. Yeah.
Well, and the other part of it is the athletes have their families, right? They got relationships. So we have family empathy circles. So it's in terms of the culture, let's say the team culture, is this space, but they have, cultures outside of that space, right? And they can actually take the empathy circle with their families. There's all kinds of, stresses that happen in the family, conflicts, and I'm sure with sports it's pretty demanding on their time, so probably
Yeah.
affects families, and that they have a way of creating those cultures of empathy in their families too.
Yeah, and the coaches in elite sport today like to encourage families getting together because they're going through similar things. Like you say, they're all missing their husband or their fathers or whatever. So they have the sports clubs of this century have creches, they have coffee mornings, they have all sorts of different things going on around the club, so that families can interact with one another and become closer. Because all of that helps bring the team closer together as well.
Okay, well, where's your, did I cover the main headings? Was there any that I left out? We had
Yeah.
self-empathy, empathic communication, empathic accuracy, developing empathy, the person-centered focus, empathic climates, and empathic relationships. So is
Yeah.
there...
That's all. That's my book in a nutshell.
Yeah. So is there more to add to that? Like what kind of, where are you going with this, and anything
Well,
else to add?
I kind of hint at it in the book in the start and the beginning of the book that I think that this way of leading people is part of who we are as human beings. I'm sure you'd agree anyway. But if you look back through human history, 90% of human history, I think we were probably leading in this way, where we were having a leader was having constant dynamic communication with the group that they led, understanding the strengths of individuals, who was the best at going to scout new pastures, who was the best at hunting, chasing down an animal or something, understanding all these different perspectives, intentions, strengths. That was the way of leading for 90% of our history. And it was only when farming and then the Industrial Revolution came in that we had this sort of top-down leadership where understanding the individual was irrelevant. It was not valued at all of a sudden. And I think we've got stuck with that over the years. When it comes back to the important things about things like sport, where it's really vital that we get people understanding each other, communicating well, working together, and trusting one another, that empathy as a leadership style has developed. It shouldn't be a surprise when you look at it from that perspective. And I think it offers a really great platform to go into other industries, because all industries I can think of would benefit from a more empathic style of leadership rather than a sort of top-down dictatorial style.
Yeah, have you sort of done any research or looked into other industries, kind of what's happening there with empathic leadership? Because I'm seeing, I track all the different articles that come out, and
Yeah,
in the work, there's a lot of talk, Forbes, etc. They're talking
yeah.
about this empathic leadership. So it seems to be sort of a trend.
Yeah, there's a few things, a few articles on medicine. You know, that's an interesting area, because I've spoken to some people, like a neurosurgeon, who talks about the lack of empathy necessary to do his work. If he's thinking about things too much from the patient's perspective while he's literally choosing which area of brain to cut, it can be a difficult thing. And I know there's been links to scores on psychopathy scales for people who do jobs like that, where they've got to be very cold. But I've had other people disagree with that and say that it's ability to switch that off and on when you can. So education, I've heard work going on in education about developing more empathic style of leadership. There's been studies in business. I know I've read a few studies done a few years ago where they looked at the empathy levels and perceived value of empathy within students at different schools at university. And business students tend to be the lowest scoring for that. They don't really value empathy and they don't behave very empathically, which we might sort of understand if we think about, somebody who goes into business is usually looking to get to the top themselves and maybe not thinking about serving others or the people around them. But I think that's changing a little bit. Like you say, there's so many articles these days about the importance of empathic leadership. And I think when people in all other industries see that empathic leadership is working well in examples that are very transparent and apparent, like sport, then it's going to catch on even more, because if you ignore empathy in your work as a leader, I think you're doing yourself a disservice.
Well, that just addressing that issue of if you're a surgeon, you have to turn off your empathy. With it, it depends on how you see empathy. If you see empathy as an individualistic situation, as just the surgeon being empathic or not, or you see the relationship, that empathy is a relationship. So to be fully, empathic in the relationship, the surgeon needs to be focused on what they're doing. And I see that as actually being empathic. Like, hey, I can't be getting, having all kinds of emotions that are dysfunctional. I need the emotion of concentration and focus and skill to apply to this to do a good job for the well-being of the other person. So it kind of depends on how you define empathy, and I define it in that relationship. So what the surgeon is doing is actually an empathic approach by having that focus and concentration, because that's going to be for the well-being of the person. So
I think the concern is does that put the surgeon under more stress? Well, I think empathy in medicine in general is bound to be useful. I mean, I don't know about in America, but in this country, we've seemed to have gone away from the practice of having a family doctor that's familiar to us, and we go to a local GP surgery where we might get any one of 6 or 7 doctors. And as far as empathy is concerned and knowing individuals, that's not very useful. So a doctor who knows someone well will understand better the pain thresholds of somebody, or whether they're a hypochondriac, or whether they are really genuine and somebody who's not going to complain much. Those little bits of information are really important in order to get decisions right for medics. So I can understand empathy being really important in that domain.
Yeah, so it's really about having those relationships and everything that you've been saying too. You have to be able to go deeper into the experience of the other person instead of see that superficiality.
Sure.
So, okay, well, that this maybe is a good point for closing, unless you have any final comment that you'd like to share before we close.
No, just to wish you luck with the Empathy Centre. It's obviously a very exciting project.
Okay, well, thanks, Peter, for joining me in this conversation.